Now, I feel like we've talked about a lot of great horror documentaries on this channel over the last couple years, like Crystal Lake Memories, His Name Was Jason, Never Sleep Again, Halloween 25 Years of Terror, but I haven't talked about one yet that really changed the game. This one comes all the way back from 2011. It's from my favorite horror movie of all time, More Brains, A Return to the Living Dead. This documentary was so incredible because this is when I kind of realized that my favorite movie of all time was Return of the Living Dead. No, it wasn't my first documentary that I had seen. In reality, I think I didn't even see More Brains until after seeing Crystal Lake Memories or even Never Sleep Again. But it kind of just snuck past me. In 2011, I was just now seeing this movie. I had only seen Return of the Living Dead maybe a year before this. Maybe 2009 when I watched the movie. But my point is, Return of the Living Dead's documentary More Brains was really a trailblazer, because this is one of those documentaries that could show you could do something completely feature-length just on one movie. You know, obviously, Crystal Lake Memories and 25 Years of Terror go over complete franchises in a runtime, but to really break down a movie in complete depth like they did for More Brains is, quite frankly, incredible. And it's one of my favorite docs of all time. Now, I'm just going to get this out in the open right now. This whole thing is narrated by Brian Peck. It almost feels like Brian Peck kind of got away with what he did, and he was a part of his circle still for a long time. You know, watching that Nickelodeon documentary showed that not only did he kind of just do his time quietly and get out of it, but he had so many people write him support letters saying that there was a one-time incident and he's not that kind of person. That's really troubling, to be honest with you. I think that's one of the more troubling things about that. But the same way, I'll say that I like the movie Jeepers Creepers, and I don't want it to disappear because of all the people that were involved making that. People like Justin Long, the cast, the crew. I don't want to make this documentary go away because of Brian Peck, because of everybody else involved that made the movie so great. I always like to just touch on that and not pretend it didn't happen. So yes, Brian Peck, you're a rat son of a bitch. The thing about this that I love watching now is we have two icons that are missing from us. We have James Cameron gone and Clu Gulager, who passed away a couple years ago. Clu was well into his 90s, and I think James was in his late 80s when he passed, but to see both of these guys on this documentary is really special. They're so full of life and they're hysterical, and Clu seemed to have some serious issues with the director Dan O'Bannon during this movie. There's one story in here about how Clu got so angry with Dan O'Bannon one time that he actually threw something, a can or a jar, at Dan as soon as he closed the door. And that's the thing about More Brains that's so special, is you're going to learn watching a documentary like this that some of the best movies do not have smooth making ofs. As a matter of fact, this movie had a horrible making of. There was so much problems on the set of Return of the Living Dead, and there was a lot of things I learned about this that were kind of sad. Like Miguel Nunez at the time was homeless. He was really trying to make it as an actor, and he was struggling so much that he was staying in homeless shelters at the time, and he hid that from the cast and crew. He didn't tell anybody about that or wanted to get any sympathy, so I can respect that from Miguel big time, and he's awesome in the movie. As a matter of fact, everybody in Return of the Living Dead is awesome. One of the greatest things about this, too, is how you learn that William Munns, a.k.a. Bill Munns, was hired to work on special effects in this movie, and William Stout, the man who was in charge of all the production design and basically guy who was really in charge of the movie in a lot of ways, was not happy with anything Bill Munns was doing. There's a scene in the movie where you see this cadaver come out of the freezer room after the 245 trioxin barrel leak, and there's this incredible behind-the-scenes image of what Bill Munns wanted to do, where he basically took a guy, put a bunch of foam in a shirt over his head, and cut out eye holes to make it look like he was headless, but the body was like an extra 4 feet tall, which is so bad to see. And he was soon fired after this. Now, Bill will tell you that he had no money and no time to do anything, but William Stout was not having any of it. So there was a lot of behind-the-scenes drama. There's also a lot of stories about how Dan O'Bannon was just kind of an unhinged man. I think there's even a story where Beverly, the star of the movie, talked about going to meet him in the beginning, and then Dan O'Bannon had porn and guns in the room going on. So she walks into this room to read for the movie. There's porn on the TV, and the table's full of guns. So she talked about getting up and running out. Dan seems to be a very eccentric man, but there's no denying the guy can write some classic stuff. I mean, let's just look at Alien, for example. This DVD is really awesome, though. The thing that's so cool about the More Brains DVD is, of course, you get this complete documentary about Part 1, but what really blew me away is when you go to the special features on this, you're going to see that they actually have a whole 29-minute documentary for Part 2 called They Won't Stay Dead, a look at Return of the Living Dead Part 2. And I love the making of for part 2. It's kind of sad, though, that they talk negative about this for the most part. Now, Kenny Myers, who was really involved in part 2 during that time, had less than thrilling things to say about Ken Wiederhorn, but it's interesting how his tune changed a little bit as time went on the Blu-ray hit Scream Factory did, and they re-interviewed him for that he looks back at the movie and can see it for what it is now, and he actually enjoys it. But he talked a lot about Ken Wiederhorn just kind of being checked out of the movie. But I think in reality, Ken Wiederhorn was just doing his job. He wasn't really enamored with wanting to do a zombie film, but he took the job because he needed a job, and he was trying to break into the movie business. So I can understand that. Me personally, I think Ken did a superb job for part 2, and I really like the special feature for that. You know, it's 29 minutes in length, so it's almost feature length on part 2, and they go into a lot of detail about the making of on this. And it's unfortunate Don Calfa wasn't in this movie too, because he read for the part to be that doctor that we see in part 2, but Ken didn't like him, so Don Calfa was not picked to be in Return of the Living Dead part 2, which is kind of sad, to be honest with you. That's one thing I would change. Another thing that's really cool is there's also a part 3 documentary on here called Love from Beyond the Grave, and that's a 19-minute documentary that actually gets Brian Usna, the writer John Penny, and they talk all about the making of part 3 on this. They talked about how the movie came to be. They talked about how different the movie business was at this point. This was the early 90s, so they were trying to make the third Return of the Living Dead film. And yeah, it was really interesting to see how this movie came to be and how different of a direction that this movie went into. It was totally different from parts 1 or 2. And to me, part 3 is a great Return of the Living Dead film. I love Melinda Clarke, but then again, who doesn't? She is everything for that movie. Now, there's a few ways you can watch this documentary if you want to. Well, the first way is obviously owning this DVD. I think that this DVD is somewhat out of print and maybe a little bit hard to get, but fear not if you don't have this DVD and you don't want to pay out of print prices for it. So Scream Factory did something really great. On the Scream Factory Blu-ray release and 4K release, considering the Blu-ray release is now out of print as well, the 4K release from Scream Factory includes the documentary More Brains on here, so you can watch that whole thing and enjoy it no problem. And what's even cooler than that is on the Scream Factory Blu-ray for part 2, they included the They Won't Stay Dead documentary that was a bonus feature on this, on that as well. So you can have that too. But having this DVD, I think, is really important because it's a piece of history in terms of those horror documentaries and how good they were when those were really starting to come out during this time. And I think the Return of the Living Dead one is really a trailblazer in taking one movie and going into every specific detail from inception to the end. The thing about this documentary that's so great is how a lot of people in here talk about how they didn't really get along. Things weren't great, and it really wasn't a fun movie to make. He made these actors go through hell repeating scenes time after time after time again. Beverly Randolph talked about one scene in the movie where she trips in the mud trying to run away from zombies and having to do it over and over again all throughout the night. And she almost wonders if Dan did it to torture her. I don't know. I don't know Dan O'Bannon, obviously, so it's hard to say. But when you watch the movie, it's clear that the guy had a clear vision for this, and he wasn't going to stop till he made the movie he wanted to. And look, it's my favorite movie of all time. So I can't really say that I think he was trying to mess with her. I think the guy just knew what he wanted. Another thing I really like about this documentary, too, is how they go into the marketing. There was a guy that was involved in marketing the movie and also marketing part 2 at this time. And he talked about how really nobody at the time, at Orion, thought this movie was going to be anything. Matter of fact, they kind of laughed at it when he brought up how this could be a big title for the company at the time. So it just goes to show that even when they were making these horror movies in the 80s, it's weird how the companies don't have any faith in it to do anything. Why make it to begin with then? I just find that really bizarre. Return of the Living Dead rubbed it in all those producers' faces when this movie ended up doing really good during this time. But yeah, this DVD is really cool. I don't think More Brains had a Blu-ray release in America, but there is a German Blu-ray release of the documentary that you can get. Here's the cover art of Return to the Living Dead, the definitive Return of the Living Dead documentary. And on the inside, we've got our disc and our title card. This was still during a time where title cards were a thing, and you gotta love that. If you haven't seen this and you're a Return of the Living Dead fan, I promise you, you're gonna get an absolute kick out of More Brains. It is one of the greatest horror documentaries of all time, and this is a super important piece of physical media in my collection. I probably put 1,000 miles on this DVD when I got it in like a year's time. It was so rewatchable, which I think is an important quality in documentaries. It's one thing to learn about a movie, but it's another thing to be comforted when learning about a movie, and I think the More Brains documentary does that as well as any other horror documentary there is. I think You're So Cool, Brewster is getting re-released soon, maybe from Kino, I can't remember, but we're definitely going to talk about that because apparently if you get the original release of the documentary, they talk all about part 2, which hopefully this release is going to do as well. If not, I may have to go back and try to find a copy of that You Are So Cool, Brewster documentary. But when it comes to the horror documentaries in the world, guys, More Brains is absolutely one of the best and one you should definitely try to add to your collection. But if you can't get this at a cheap price, like I said, go watch the More Brains documentary that's included on the Scream Factory releases, and I guarantee you'll think it's one of the best documentaries for horror ever done. So yeah, guys, I just wanted to pay tutelage to More Brains, a documentary about my all-time favorite horror movie, Return of the Living Dead. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care. Huge giant thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Without you guys, this would not be possible. To get behind-the-scenes photos, videos, music, private live streams, and much more, you can subscribe to my Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Thank you to my patrons.